Hi, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you today to our first Research Connects uh, um, webinar. My name is Dr. Heather Cook, and I am the Provincial Coordinator of Knowledge Mobilization here at the Alzheimer Society of B.C. So as part of my role at the Society, I help make research more accessible by connecting researchers and experts in the field, like our guest speaker this evening, with those who use research. So those of you in our audience this evening. So this evening's presentation is the first in a new webinar series called Research Connects. And as we begin this evening, I'd like to just take a moment and acknowledge that the land on which I'm situated today and speaking to you this evening is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I also acknowledge that you're joining us from around the province of British Columbia. And so I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners, both past and present, of those lands as well. Now, before we begin, please note that you can see the meeting controls by clicking or tapping at the top or the bottom of the meeting window. And because of this is one of our more formal presentations, we're actually going to keep everyone's cameras turned off and microphones muted. But we definitely want to hear from you. You'll see when you click on those meeting controls, you'll see the little dialogue bubble, which is the chat function. And so we encourage you to use that chat box to share your questions and thoughts as we listen to Jen Lyle and Dr. Hsiung this evening. We'll be monitoring the chat and we'll put your questions forward to Dr. Hsiung once he and Jen are finished their conversation. So we're planning to take about 40 minutes for that conversation between Jen and Robin, and then we'll turn it over to the audience questions. So on that note, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening. Our CEO at the Alzheimer Society of B.C, Jen Lyle, and with her is Dr. Hsiung. Dr. Hsiung is an associate professor in the Division of Neurology, the Department of Medicine at UBC, and he's staff neurologist at the UBC Hospital Clinic for the Alzheimer's disease and related disorders, and at St. Paul's Hospital. So his research interests include the epidemiology of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, neuropsychological characteristics of cognitive disorders, and imaging and biomarkers of dementia. So welcome to you both. I know we've got a great evening in store here. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the two of you.
Thanks very much, Heather, and thank you to Dr. Hsiung for joining us here today. Let's just start with the basics. So, Dr. Hsiung, maybe you can begin by telling us, what is lecanemab and how does it work?
So lecanemab is one of the new monoclonal antibodies that is aimed to remove amyloid. So we have been talking about it in our Alzheimer's forum at UBC once in a while. So we're trying to update our patients on the understanding of the disease. So based on all the genetic studies of Alzheimer's, Alzheimer's disease pathology is associated with excessive amyloid in the brain, and these amyloid will accumulate and become plaques, which is what we see when people pass away and we look at the brain. So these monoclonal antibody, including lecanemab, is designed to bind to the amyloid to remove them. And the theory is that if we can stop the accumulation of these plaques, we can prevent the progression of Alzheimer's. So this theory has been around since the first gene discovery back in the 1990s. And a lot of animal models, most transgenic models, are based on these genetic mutations. So the mutation causes excessive amyloid production. And based on these models, if you remove them, you can treat the mouse. So that's what we are observing in the mouse model for a number of years. but we have not been successful in human for almost 20 years. And you know that I've been in this career for over 20 years, and we've seen a lot of negative study. And lecanemab, and before that, aducanumab, are the first two medications that actually showed a human benefit. So we were very excited about it.
Well, thanks for sharing that background, Dr. Hsiung. And I don't think it's lost on anyone that when it comes to research, it can be a field that's both hopeful and at the same time frustrating when you look at long periods of a perceived lack of progress. But I'll come back to that in a minute. When we start talking about lecanemab, let's talk a little bit more about who it's designed for. So you referenced research. What does the research say about who would benefit most from the drug?
So before any drug comes into the market, it has to go through clinical trials. And that's what one of my research area is, to conduct clinical trials and see what works and what doesn't. So in this particular clinical trial, it's a very specific population, and they are aimed at what we called mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's or very mild Alzheimer's disease. So in more clinical terms, people are more familiar with a test. So we often use the MMSE test to score how their memory is doing. And it's actually on the very high range. And the MMSE's inclusion criteria is between 22 to 30. So 30 is actually normal. So it's very, very mild disease at stage, and 21 is already too advanced, and we still call it mild Alzheimer's in the clinic, but it's already too late. So it's in a very early stage. People have very early memory problems, and they also have to have proven pathology. That's when the new biomarkers come in, because in some of the earlier monoclonal antibody trials, one of the earlier one is called bapineuzumab, and that was a negative study. But in that particular clinical trial, after it was finished and was found to be negative, a subset of people actually got the PET scan that was very new back in 2008. The amyloid PET scan is something new, and they decided to do that as part of the study and find out who actually have amyloid. And they found out that over 1/3 of the people actually do not have amyloid. So by clinical diagnosis only, if we just use memory and a brain scan just to make sure that they don't have strokes and tumor, but their brain generally looks okay, and they only have mild memory and cognitive impairment, a lot of people actually don't have Alzheimer's pathology. What that is, that's another whole hour to talk, so I won't go into that. But in order to be qualified to go into that clinical trial, you have to have this mild cognitive impairment and some memory difficulties, and you also have to have biomarker proven Alzheimer's pathology. So I mentioned that PET scan is one way to prove that there's amyloid in the brain. Another way is to use spinal fluid analysis. So we take some fluid from your back and measure it and make sure that there's actually amyloid changes in the brain that is consistent with Alzheimer's disease. And these people are the ones who are qualified to go into the clinical trial and go through the experimental studies. So that's what we are aiming for. If these medications get approved, then this will be the type of patients that would be qualified to receive the treatment.
Well, thanks for sharing all of that, Dr. Hsiung. And for people who are listening in the call, Dr. Hsiung used the term biomarkers, and you explained how you can look for some of those biomarkers in spinal fluid. And I'm hearing it's just like, for example, how we use blood glucose as a biomarker for diabetes, for example. We have biomarkers that we can access through cerebral spinal fluid as a way of being able to assess or evaluate for Alzheimer's disease.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more then about the early clinical trials on lecanemab. Why have they received so much attention?
Well, twofold. Well, it got FDA approved in the States, so that's one big news. But the main thing is that of the many monoclonal antibodies that have been being tested in the last 20 years, this one and the one previous to that was the aducanumab was clearly showing biomarker change. So from what the biomarker measures are is mostly by PET scans. So we are able to use a ligand that stick to amyloid, and we use the PET scan to show that patients with the disease have increased amyloid in the brain. And with this treatment with lecanemab and the other previous aducanumab, they were able to show that there's decreased amyloid in the PET scan after about a year or so, almost back to the level of normal people. So that's quite significant. So there is a 7 to 80% reduction that is demonstrated on the PET scan. So that was exciting. The initial excitement was on aducanumab was back in 2018 when the first clinical trial shows the benefit, and they were very excited about it. So in this particular trial, that became a significant buzz in the area is because other than the biomarker, they also showed clinical benefits. So their memory score was declining. They're still declining, but they're declining slower, and they're significantly different from the non-treated group. And we also use another scale we call the clinical dementia rating, CDR scale, which is something that we use in clinical trials a lot to measure the global impairment. And there's also a clear signal separation. So the people receiving treatment are declining slower compared to the people who are receiving placebo. And in addition, a number of the biomarkers are also showing benefit. So I mentioned the spinal fluid. That's one way to measure chemical changes in the brain. It's showing decreased tau accumulation as well. So not just amyloid, but there's decreased tau, which means that probably the downstream benefits are also present, although it was only a year and a half, so we don't really know what the long-term effect is. But it's significant enough that it requires further investigations. And we have ongoing clinical trials looking at these issues, and also open label extension for the people in the first clinical trial. And we're following up to learn what are the long-term effects.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I know we're going to touch on the clinical trials that are happening here in BC in a couple minutes. I want to go back to the question around lecanemab. Oh, so we've talked about some of the beneficial things that we've seen coming out of the clinical trials. Are there any downsides to lecanemab? So, for example, are there any specific safety concerns?
So definitely, there's always two sides to the coin. Every drug has a side effect. So with this class of medication, the monoclonal antibody, early on, we have already noticed something called ARIA, which is the same word as the opera singing, the ARIA, but it stands for amyloid-related imaging abnormality, ARIA. And there are two types of abnormality. One is the accumulation of water, so the edema in the brain. So there's some swelling in the brain. And the more severe one is actually bleeding. So when amyloid leaves the brain, a little bit of it may cause the blood vessel to be leaky. And we notice that it happens in some patients receiving the treatment. It does happen. Both of these can happen without treatment. So it does happen in the placebo as well. It's probably just related to Alzheimer's disease as well. But in the treatment group, these abnormalities are much more common. So the edema is up to about 30%. So 3 in 10 people who are started under treatment will see some of the edema, and a smaller number, maybe 2 or 3% of the people will have some hemorrhage. So these are significant risks.
Thanks for sharing that, Dr. Hsiung, and I take your point that there's two sides to every coin. When we were talking earlier around why the results from the early clinical trials on lecanemab had received so much attention, one of the things that you mentioned was the approval that happened in the US. So let's talk about that. So, what does the advanced approval of lecanemab in the US by the FDA mean for British Columbians?
That's a good question because we don't really know. This is something completely new. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about the US approval, the FDA approval process that is new, and it's a little bit controversial because in regular approval, they require 2 phase 3 clinical trials showing consistent positive findings before that they would approve it. And usually they also require clear clinical benefits. The clinical measurements are the things that I mentioned to you. Some of the scales that we use are memory scales like MMSE. In clinical trials, we use something called ADAS-Cog, which is a more detailed memory testing, and the CDR, which is a global measurement of clinical benefit. So in order to get approval, you have to demonstrate both global improvement or benefits and a specific cognitive benefit. That has been in place ever since the first donepezil medication was approved like 25 years ago. But with the Alzheimer's Association in the States, they are pushing the FDA because they argue that currently there's no treatment for Alzheimer's, and these other treatments are only but marginally benefit. So it may slow a progression for a year or two, but it doesn't really stop the disease. So they made the FDA classify Alzheimer's as a non-treatable disease, which becomes the same category of a number of non-treatable cancer. And for cancer treatment, their approval is more expedient because they don't require the strong clinical benefit, and they accept biomarker readout. So if there is a reduction in, say, a measure, if you have blood count with a cancer, if you can measure these blood count coming down, you don't have to show that you're actually getting stronger. So they just approve based on biomarker findings. And based on this, they showed the spinal fluid benefit and the brain scan benefit. So that's when the first approval of the aducanumab a year ago got approved. And it was very controversial because it's a... Sorry about that. So some people agree because Alzheimer's is currently non-treatable, so any benefit, we should try them out and allow people to consider using the medication. But then some other people argue that because it's not as imminent a death as in untreatable cancer, which is usually death within 6 to 12 months, whereas even though you have untreatable Alzheimer's, if you diagnose it early, most people may have a good quality of life for another 5 years and can live 10 to 15 years. So there's a lot of controversy as to whether you can just use biomarkers for approval or not. In any case, that was in discussion, but now the lecanemab got approved because in addition to biomarker, they also showed clinical benefit. So that was quite an excitement. And at least it proved that the theory works. You just have to treat people much earlier. And a number of these monoclonal antibodies in the past were treating people with mild Alzheimer's to moderate Alzheimer's, and it's probably too late. We have to treat them just at the very beginning. By the time you have biomarker changes, and you have memory impairment, just very mild memory impairment, that's probably the latest that we want to treat people.
Yeah, I can appreciate how it's a nuanced conversation, and in many ways we are in uncharted territory. So appreciate the context. We talked a little bit about clinical trials and how there's still very much research that's ongoing in this. Can British Columbians join the latest trial when it comes to lecanemab?
So lecanemab, I just looked it up. They are actually not recruiting anymore. There are 2 ongoing clinical trials, mostly in North America, and one that is recruiting, but UBC is not a site. So I don't think any British Columbia sites are recruiting. I think Toronto has some. Actually, one Toronto site is part of the A345 study that is recruiting. And that one is recruiting an even earlier population. So that one, they're recruiting people with really no significant memory impairment, but they have a family risk factor and they have early changes with biomarkers. So you do a spinal tap or a PET scan and show that you have amyloid, and you're getting treated. Again, it's controversial because they actually have no symptoms. Then do you call these people Alzheimer's? Again, is a lot of philosophical and scientific argument, because if you don't have memory impairment, you don't call it Alzheimer's disease. Whereas in the other camp, the scientists say that if you have biomarker changes, you will eventually get Alzheimer's. And that is the best time to treat it, is to before you have any cognitive symptoms. So as a researcher, I tend to agree more with the scientific camp that if you have biomarker changes, that already sets you off in the disease trajectory. So I am probably in that camp, but there are people who believe that if you're walking around completely normal, then who cares if there's amyloid in the brain? So there are different people with different ways of thinking. I think the eventual answer will come out as we are doing our longitudinal biomarker studies. So one of the large study is called ADNI. We have been a participating site for over 15 years, and we're continuously following people. And we do have a number of these people who were very early on and diagnosed with amyloid changes and biomarkers. And it seems like if we follow them long enough, everybody will eventually get Alzheimer's. But why do some people get it earlier and some people get it later? And that's still a big scientific question, and we don't know why. I suspect there may be genetic modifying factors. Some people have the genes and will make the disease come on sooner than later. And some people may have protective genes that can protect them for a longer period of time.
As you're talking to Dr. Hsiung, I'm reflecting on sort of twofold. One, how much we still don't know. And also, two, just the increasing importance and relevance of getting that early diagnosis as we start to shift towards that model whereby we're intervening earlier and earlier in the disease process in the hopes of being able to change what that process looks like down the road. So very much appreciate comments on that. So here's the big question.
Just looking back at your questions, I probably skirted your question of whether we're going to get it in Canada or whether people can go to the States and get the medication. That is complex because some sites are providing the treatment already. So I know some private sites in Seattle are starting to provide this. But some of the academic sites, like the university sites, are still very hesitant. So most of us want more data. So we some of the academic sites are only giving it when they are following patients in a research protocol. But some other private sites are actually giving it as long as you're willing to pay for it.
I think that brings up some other challenging questions that we could spend a lot of time talking about when we talk about equity when it comes to access.
Yeah.
But I mean, you mentioned something, and I want to go to that question, which is, and admittedly a bit speculative. When do you think we might see, if at all, lecanemab available in Canada? And are there specific changes that we might need to make to our healthcare infrastructure if indeed the case is that lecanemab is approved for use in Canada?
Yeah, so that is a lot of discussion in the background within our clinic and within our research and clinical community. So if it becomes available, how are we going to implement it? Are we able to afford it? They haven't given us a price yet, but I think in the States, it's somewhere around $25,000 per year. And based on the clinical trial, you probably have to treat at least 2 years. And then how long to go on for, we don't really know. So do you need to stay on the treatment forever, or can you treat it kind of like an induction, like a chemotherapy? You give a blast in the beginning, and once stabilized, then you have a maintenance dose. Those are all questions that we have in mind, but we don't have the answer. So we will need a lot of studies to find out how to optimally use the medication. But as to Canada, Health Canada has their own approval process, which I think is a good thing. So they don't have to care about what the FDA does. So they have their own criteria and will review it. I am not involved, so I cannot tell when they're going to approve it, but usually it takes much longer, usually in about a year or so. And after approval, that's only allowing the drug to be used in Canada. Doesn't mean that it will be covered in Canada. So whether the provincial government will cover these treatments or not is another step. And again, some other review panel in each province will review and decide how to use the medication. But if we look forward to everything going ahead as expected, and we get approval in Health Canada, and we also get coverage from the provincial government, then is the capacity. Currently, it requires infusion. So lecanemab is a very frequent infusion. You need an IV every 2 weeks. So you have to come to the hospital, get an IV. The IV will drip for about half an hour to an hour. So you have to be monitored by the nurse, make sure that you're safe before and after. And so that's the treatment side. But the monitoring side, as I mentioned, about 30% of the people initially, when they get treated, will have some brain swelling called ARIA. And it can only be diagnosed with MRI. So if we are having a lot of people starting treatment, then we also need to increase the capacity of getting MRI scans. Otherwise, people will be having side effects that we're not aware of. We are not able to follow them. So those are all big questions that we have. If it gets approved and if it gets covered, how are we actually able to implement it? That's a big question.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing too is it's a question with multiple answers, because it's not only the ability to deliver the infusion, but we're also looking at the imaging capacity for ongoing monitoring to catch people who may be experiencing ARIA-related complications and all of those things. So I very much appreciate that it's nuanced about it. So, you know, I want to do a plug here now, just to let our audience know that now is your opportunity to start thinking about those questions and popping them in the chat box. We very much want to hear from you. We'll be going to those shortly. But one other question that I have for you, Dr. Hsiung. I mean, we've talked about, you know, what it aims to do. We've talked about what the potential benefits and the potential side effects are. But do you speak a little bit more about how long the treatment lasts? I know you mentioned that it's something that we don't have full line of sight on, but is this something that's indefinite? Is it something that, to your point, we look at a chemotherapy type approach where there's an intensive period followed by maintenance? What does it look like presently in those clinical trials?
I think we're leaning towards the chemotherapy type of treatment. So initially you will get some intense treatment, and after the amyloid is lowered, we can follow that by CSF or other type of biomarker measurements. Once those biomarkers get lowered, then you might be able to decrease the frequency. So maybe once a month or every 3 months or something like that, rather than every 2 weeks, which is a lot of infusions. So, but whether that actually works or not, we don't know. We'll have to look at the data. And I imagine that once this particular compound is working, it will stimulate other companies to compete and look for better compounds. So just like any drug, the first one will work, but then the newer generation may work more effectively. So maybe using a lower dose and may have a longer lasting effect. So I'm sure that companies will look into how to modify the treatment and make it more effective.
I appreciate the analogy back to cancer, because we all know that the first class of cancer drugs looked very different from where we're at now. And so I appreciate your point, how this is all very much an iterative process. I know that we're starting to get some questions, so we're gonna open it up now to the audience for some questions. One of the questions I have here is what's the best way to follow any studies and results that come out of the ongoing lecanemab research or clinical trials? And also a question like, are there any studies currently being conducted in Europe or in other places outside of North America?
Yeah, so there are lots of information going on. If you have some clinical background, the best place to look up information is called clinicaltrials.gov. Is a US regulated site, and they require any clinical trial that is conducted in the United States to be registered, and then all the information will be provided there. So, but that's only in the States. So if the medication is not being tested in the United States, they don't have the obligation to, but most international studies, with US being one of the sites, will be registered at clinicaltrials.gov. So that one will give you the information. But to interpret the data, I probably would ask you to rely on the experts in the field, because we are also learning at the same time. And without the nuanced understanding, it may be hard to interpret the findings. So I would ask you to review with your doctor, and if it's necessary, get referred to a specialist to have this better examined and looked at.
I think we've all been caught in the past of seeing a flashy headline and then diving deeper into what's behind it and realizing that the story is not fully captured. So I appreciate your point on that. Another question that's come through as well is, how does lecanemab compare to other treatments that are currently available for Alzheimer's disease?
So the currently available treatment are not that much. So there are the cholinesterase inhibitor. There are 3 of them that has been out since the late 1990s, and memantine, which has been out since the early 2000s. So there are only 4 approved medications, and all of them are symptomatic treatments. So it improves the symptoms of Alzheimer's, which is usually memory difficulties and poor concentration. And these medications does not reverse their memory loss, but it improves their concentration. So in general, they are able to respond better to questions and probably more engaged with daily activities, but it doesn't stop the process. So these new medications are different because it is not a symptomatic treatment. It is supposed to slow down the amyloid accumulation in the brain and slow down the progression of the disease. So it's a new class of treatment. And if it's strong enough, theoretically, we should slow down the disease. Whether it can actually stop the progression or not, I think it's still too early to say. We need a lot more data. I suspect it may not be enough, but who knows? Maybe there will be a strong medication that will actually stop the progression.
Yeah, and I very much appreciate that we're still in early days. There's another question here too around going back to the approval process, and it's specifically around timelines. So considering the approval process in Canada, best guess, or what are the timelines you foresee for this drug to become available for patients in Canada or BC? And I guess there's that important caveat of if it's approved, because we also know that nothing is ever a done deal.
Right. So it's hard to know. Usually, based on previous experience, when there's a very positive clinical trial, then they usually will approve within a year or so for Health Canada approval. But as I mentioned earlier, it's only approval to license the drug to be used. It doesn't mean that it's covered by the provincial healthcare plan. So that's another step to look into whether it gets covered by the provincial healthcare plan or not. We don't know. Because it's not just science at that point. You're looking at economic data. They will have to crunch a lot of numbers and see whether the cost of treatment is worth it. If everyone got treated can actually stay at home and never go to a nursing home, then they may actually save money from not having so many people in nursing home. So even though it's an expensive treatment, they may have some financial benefit. So that's for the healthcare insurance people to calculate.
Yeah, and I also appreciate that there's multiple moving parts to this. There's the approval process, but then to your point, there's the question around coverage, which factors into it as well. So thank you for that. One of the other questions that we have is, how do you see lecanemab potentially fitting into the broader landscape of treatments for Alzheimer's disease? So for example, would it be possible in a future state for someone to both be receiving lecanemab and be on Aricept, for example?
Yeah, so this is an add-on therapy, so it does not affect the currently available treatment. So everyone who are on the currently available treatment can still receive lecanemab. But as I mentioned, because it's aiming for the milder patients, it's more likely that you will start lecanemab first as your very early treatment. And if you have other symptoms, you can add Aricept later on. So that's more likely to be the case if we're trying to treat the mild cognitive impairment phase of patients.
Yeah, thanks for that. And then the other thing that I'm appreciating as well is that, to sort of paraphrase a little bit, it's also one tool in a potential toolkit. So we would look at this in combination with other things like including non-pharmaceutical interventions like exercise and good nutrition and the like.
Exactly. Yes. So again, using the cancer therapy, we know that probably it's not just one drug. Sometimes you need a combination of drugs. And so lecanemab is focusing on the amyloid, but we also know that there are other problems going on in the brain during the disease process, inflammation, tau accumulation. So it may require multiple treatment to target different mechanism of the disease. So in the future, I think it will be more like cancer chemotherapy. You may need combination A plus B plus C in order to actually treat the disease.
And I think to your point too, that speaks to just the complexity of the disease processes behind Alzheimer's disease as well. So I very much appreciate your point and the analogy back to cancer. Maybe a broader question for you, Dr. Hsiung. We've talked about how, you mentioned that it's been 20 plus years in the field up until this point when we start to see things like lecanemab hitting the scene, or aducanumab, and research into things like that, what are the key challenges associated with developing drugs for Alzheimer's disease?
Well, the hardest thing is we don't really have a good model. Most of the models are based on the genetic mutation. So, and some people argue that the genetic form of Alzheimer's is not the same as the random or the more common type of Alzheimer's, which we see in the older population. The genetic form of disease are young onset. Usually they have disease starting in their 40s and 50s. In theory, the treatment are designed for those type of patients and not necessarily for the people who start to have symptoms in their 70s. And it's whether it's true or not, there's still a lot of scientific debate.
And it's funny, as we were just speaking there was another question, sort of continues the theme of what we've been talking about around benefits and who would best benefit. Taking the scenario where lecanemab is approved in Canada, so this is a question that just came in. Taking the scenario where lecanemab is approved in Canada, would it be likely that it is only prescribed for mild cognitive impairment or very early on in the disease process? Why not just give it to people who are still at home, somewhat functioning, where there could still be benefit?
Right. So that's a good question. Again, when people design the clinical trial, they probably just go for the population with the biggest bang for the buck. So we're most likely to see the separation of the placebo versus a treatment line. When people are already partway through their disease journey, their change will not be as significant. So in clinical trials, they did not include that population, not because that it may not be beneficial, but because they may not see an obvious difference. So, but whether that actually works in the real world or not, we don't really know. In order to know, we'll need a larger clinical trial, because if the benefits are small, you need more people to demonstrate the benefits. If the benefits are big, you will see that within 20 people are better, 20 people are getting worse. It's very obvious. But when the benefits are mild, you may need 1,000 people on each group, and you will see a difference of about 10%. Then the difference is not very big, so you need a large number to show the statistics. So whether that study will ever happen or not, I don't know. But after a drug is approved, it usually most people will use it a little bit wider than the clinical criteria. The clinical trials criteria are very strict. So when we're doing a clinical trial, we actually need to screen 4 or 5 people to get one into the study, because there will be many unexpected things that we find, and their results may be their heart rate is not regular, or they have other problems, their liver function is too high. So there are all sorts of problems that we find in real life. So in the clinical trials population is a very clean population. But whether it works in the real world, we'll have to get more experience once the medication becomes available. So how it's best used is up for debate. We'll have to see. Yeah.
And what I'm hearing too is a lot of that we'll have to see would come in theory if and when lecanemab's approved for use and becomes more widely accessible in Canada. So I appreciate your point there. Outside of the clinicaltrials.gov, which you mentioned already, what advice would you give to someone who's interested in learning more about lecanemab, or maybe even more broadly, do you have any advice for people who might be interested in participating in future clinical trials?
Well, I will advertise. Welcome to UBC. So we are involved in a number of clinical trials. So we're not recruiting for the lecanemab, but we are recruiting for the follow-up study of the aducanumab. So that was the other one that was approved last year and was very controversial, and we still need more data. So UBC is a clinical trial site for the aducanumab, and we are going to continue to recruit for that study for a while until that fills up. So that's another treatment that is similar, but also have the same side effects. So it also causes ARIA and can have microhemorrhages as well. So little bleeding in the brain. So it also have those side effects. But these two are currently the most promising one.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'm noting that we've got a little bit time for questions left, but maybe what I'll do is we'll end on this one for now. I'll just keep an eye on the chat just in case there's anything that comes in. But from your perspective, Dr. Hsiung, what are two key messages that people in the audience should take away from this evening's webinar?
Two key messages. I think first one is there's hope. After so many years that we have failed clinical trials, there are some signal that we're seeing. So once we found the signal, we are able to tweak the future treatment to find the one with the best benefit. So I think the best is yet to come, but we're starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, and we're continue moving on. So there's hope. And the second thing is, while these medications are not yet approved, there's still other things that you can do to decrease your risk. As you mentioned, there are other things that can be beneficial. For instance, watching your diet, don't eat too much cholesterol, and exercise regularly, having a good heart health is good brain health. All these are things that you can do right now. But if there's a family history, I think those are the people with the highest risk. If there's a family history, get involved in research, come to UBC, see us, because we maybe offer you some of these early treatments through an experimental protocol.
I appreciate what you're saying there, Dr. Hsiung. And as you're speaking, I was thinking these are early days, but they're hopeful days, is what I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So and just to clarify too, when you say family history, you're speaking specifically of people who may have instances of early onset Alzheimer's disease or instances of dementia in their family. Is that correct? Or do you want to elaborate on that a wee bit?
Yes, so if there's family history of young onset, so young onset, we mean under 65, that will be a high risk. But if there's a family history of older onset, it's still a risk factor, although it's not clearly a genetic cause when it's older onset, but they have genetic risk factors. And those are the people that we usually what we call a clean Alzheimer's type of dementia. It's another topic of discussion because once you get past 70 to 75, you often have more than one pathology. It's not just Alzheimer's. People have a little bit of stroke and vascular disease. That's why the vascular health is very important in that population. But there's also a mix-in of two other common pathology called TDP-43 and Lewy body. So they may mix in some Parkinson's disease, mix in some other frontotemporal dementia type pathology. And we see that in our autopsy studies. So once you get past 70 to 75, they don't just have amyloid, they have other things going on. And it's much harder to know without the biomarkers, where it's just Alzheimer's or something else. But if you're young onset, if you're 60, 65, then 95% of those people have pure Alzheimer's. They don't have anything else wrong. They just have Alzheimer's.
Right. Thanks. No, I appreciate that. And it's sort of that difference, that idea that it is possible to have more than one type of dementia. There's mixed dementia, which you mentioned. So for example, vascular dementia as well as Alzheimer's disease. So appreciate you clarifying that. So What I'm hearing is early days, but hopeful days, and an open invitation to be part of this research for anyone who may be interested. So I don't see any other questions that are coming through the chat, so I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Dr. Hsiung, and I'm going to turn it over back to Dr. Heather Cook.
Wonderful. And I've just seen actually a question just right before I leave us with some closing comments. Someone snuck in another question, and it was, can a young person get tested? Dr. Hsiung, do you want to speak a little bit about that? So I wonder.
So it depends on what that person is testing for. So there are two things. First is symptomatic testing. If a young person actually have memory problems, yes, then we would test you. But if a young person have no symptoms, then we call it asymptomatic testing. So the only time that we may consider asymptomatic testing is if there's a family history of known genetic cause. So you have to have a sibling or parent with a proven genetic disease. Then we may test the next generation. Otherwise, we don't offer it just to anyone. We only offer it if you have a proven family history of a genetic cause of Alzheimer's, because it may be important even when you're young, for instance, that family planning or career choice or how you spend your inheritance, whatever you want to do, you may want to know if you're young, but only if you have a proven family cause of the disease. But if you have no symptoms and no family history, we do not offer testing.
Wonderful. And just a follow up to that was, would you go through the testing for that? Would that just be something you could access through your family physician, through your GP?
So no, family sufficient, you probably don't know what's going on. So you will get a referral to a specialist like us at UBC. Our clinician will first review your case and probably get you to review with our genetic counselor. If you're actually eligible, then our genetic counselor will go through the process. There is a clear process to get genetic testing in a young person.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, Dr. Hsiung and Jen, thank you so much for kind of walking us through some of those questions, the more general questions and some of those really specific questions from our audience about lecanemab. I think we are all leaving this evening with a little bit more information about that going forwards. So we'd certainly love to hear from our audience this evening with regards to your thoughts around today's or this evening's webinar. So there will be a post-event survey that will arrive in your inbox early next week. And so we encourage you to take a couple of minutes to answer that. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on future topic areas for the webinar series. And you can always reach out to us, the research portfolio here at the Society. And our email is simply research@alzheimerbc.org. And we'll just pop that in the chat for you. So if there is a specific topic you'd like us to tackle, we'd love to hear from you. And we will be holding another Research Connects webinar in May 17th. And Dr. Alex Henri Bergava, who's a colleague of Dr. Hsiung's, will be joining us. Dr. Henri Bergava is based in Victoria, and he's going to talk a little more broadly about some of those other treatments that Dr. Hsiung referred to this evening, in sort of that bit more of a general form. So stay tuned for more details around that. Again, just a big thank you to Dr. Hsiung for patching in this evening to walk us through that, to all our attendees, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the future. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you very much.